All right, Shavuot, say good morning. Let's begin. So today's daf, the beautiful daf ahead of us. Today's Chav Gimel. We are picking up 23. We are picking up on Chav Beis and with base 22b, and we're going to pick up by the Mishnah. Last Mishnah on the page 22b. Only Mishnah on the page towards the bottom. Marchikin as hasulam min hashovach arba amos. So we distance the ladder from the dovecote. This matter from the dovecote 4 amos. So let's just remember again, dovecote, kishmo, kenhu, is the place where a person raises doves. So you have to go ahead. Essentially what the Gemara is saying, or the Mishnah is saying is, you can't leave a ladder leaning against a dovecote. So not only can you not leave it leaning against the dovecote, but you need to distance it a distance of at least dalet amos from the dovecote. Why? Kadesh lo tikpot hanamiya. In order that hanamiya is like a weasel. In order that the weasel, in other words, hanamiya is just an example, but the concern over here is what? If you leave a ladder against the dovecote, that gives predatory animals the opportunity to climb up and to get into the dovecote. Therefore, you have to go ahead and distance the ladder from the dovecote at least dalet amos. Vesakosel min hamaschila dalet amos. Similarly, if I'm building a wall, there is a wall setback of dalet amos from my friend's gutter. Why? That's maschila. Why is there a wall setback of dalet amos from my friend's gutter? In order that he is able to go ahead and he needs room in order to place his ladder, meaning my neighbor needs the room to place his ladder against his gutter so as to be able to clean out his gutters. Okay, says the Gemara. So it would appear that our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yossi. How so? Di Rabbi Yossi ha'amar se'achofer b'sof shalo v'zenotea b'sof shalo. Because Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that essentially everybody could do whatever they want in their own field. That you also remember we spoke about the idea that there is a 25 amos setback. If my friend has a bar up fit, there's a 25 amos setback according to the Rabbanon when I plant a tree, in order that what? That the roots not grow out and negatively impact my friend's bar. Yet Rabbi Yossi is the one who says, listen, I could dig in my field, Reuven could dig in his field, and everybody is permitted to do whatever they want in their own field. So the Gemara suggests that our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yossi. How so? Look at Rashi. Lema masis and Rabbi Yossi. Tepalik b'seifa depirkin v'notea selachbar ubetuve mili ikab masis and devada Rabbi Yossi elalema avzu the sulam v'shovach tlok Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say this idea of the sulam and shovach must mean the idea that the Mishnah says that I have to distance my ladder from my friend's dovecote 4 amos. But why? According to Rabbi Yossi, I should be able to put my ladder wherever I want as long as what? As long as what? As long as it's my property. Right? I can't put my ladder on Reuven's property, but as long as it's in my property, I should be permitted to go ahead and put it wherever I want. Yet the Mishnah tells me that there is a mandatory ladder setback from the dovecote. So again, this does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yossi, to which the Gemara says, Afilutim Rabbi Yossi. It's not true. Our Mishnah can even reflect the view of Rabbi Yossi. I ha'amar Ravashi ki avinan be'Rav Kahana hava amar moder Rabbi Yossi begirei didei. So we'll say even Rabbi Yossi, who says that under normal circumstances you can do what you want as long as you're operating within your own property, says that as long as what? You are not directly impacting and damaging another. We'll say it's what we call girei delay. Girei delay means your own arrows. See, even Rabbi Yossi says, I can do what I want in my property, even if it technically has a damaging impact on you, or can have a damaging impact, as long as what? As long as it does not directly, negatively impact you. But if my actions directly, negatively impact and damage you, then I'm not permitted to do it, even though I'm operating on my property. So to avir hachanami zinnan de bahadi demanachle yasa b'kar v'kafza. Because we'll say in this case over here, sometimes the weasel is just looking for a way into the dovecote, and what happens? He's hiding in his hole, and as soon as I put that ladder there, boom, that weasel is going to take advantage and get into the dovecote. So therefore, I will say that would be a case of girei didei, where the placement of my ladder is directly and negatively impacting my friend's dovecote. I have a hagramu, but 1 second, is this not an act of causation? As well as let's say again, I put the ladder within dalet amos of my friend's dovecote. I put it there. The weasel jumps onto the ladder, jumps into the dovecote, is that not a case of grama? Is that not a case of causation? And again, normally we assume that grama is patra b'nizakin, right? We assume that causative damage is going to be not permitted, but is not going to be liable. So the Gemara says, you see from here that what? That there was like causative damages one would be liable for. Rav Yosef, so the Gemara tells us, Rav Yosef, Havat loi hano ta'ale. Rav Yosef and Rav Yosef ta'ale, Rashi says, are dekalim kitanim, small palm trees. Dahavu tapav chav gimel amud aleph. Dahavu asu umni v'yasi tusayu. So what happens? Rav Yosef had these palm trees and small palm trees. Bloodletters used to sit underneath it and go ahead and let blood. I don't know if that's okay. They used to go ahead and draw blood. So what happens? Va'asu or v'achli dama. The ravens would come. They would lick up the blood. V'salki abei ta'alvi mafsil tamre. Then after the ravens licked up the blood, what would they do? They would fly up to the top of the tree, and they would end up smearing the blood on the dates. Meaning they would then go sit on the tree. They would get the blood on the dates, and thereby going ahead and really ruining the dates. So Amar Luhu Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said to the bloodletters, Afikuli kor mehacha. Literally, get this crowing out of here. In other words, get the crows, right? Get the crows, get the birds out of here. Meaning what he was saying to the bloodletters is, listen, you are causing me a loss, get out of here. Amarli Abai v'hagramu. Abai said, but one second, it's grama. Meaning the bloodletters aren't really doing anything wrong, right? They're just drawing, they happen to be drawing the blood, but Lamais again, they're not damaging the dates. It happens to be the blood that spills on the ground, ultimately is being picked up by the birds and being lifted up to the dates. But they're not doing anything. Amarli Hachi Amrav Tuimaras, Zos Amaras, Grama b'nizakin aser. Let's say, what do you see from here? You see from here that it is prohibited to engage in causative damages. That you are not permitted to cause someone damages, even through a grama, even through an indirect fashion. But one second. Let's say the case over here is the bloodletters had already been engaging in this practice underneath these trees of Rav Yosef for a while. So did the bloodletters not have a chazakah on the usage of the palm trees, or the area underneath the palm trees from bloodletting? I'll say this is actually very interesting. Ha'amrav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua Ein Chazaka Lenizakin. But say we're going to actually talk about this later on. I mean, not today, but later on in this Masechta. It's a fascinating discussion. There's no such thing as a chazaka for damaging actions. In other words, if I do, let's say what we will discuss essentially is an important yesod, which is that if I go ahead and I use your property, or I use someone's property in a certain way for a certain amount of time, in an uncontested fashion, then what's the halacha? The halacha is I establish a chazaka of use. Now, how that is, the parameters of that we'll discuss. What the Gemara is suggesting over here is, if I am using someone's property in a way that is damaging to that person's property, even if I used it for a long time, and even if the person never said anything, ein chazaka l'nizakin. There is no such thing as a chazaka for actions that are damaging to the property owner. Therefore, again, even if the bloodletters were there for years, Lamai said their actions are damaging, and therefore, again, they established no chazaka on the land. But one second, did we not discuss about this? Rav Mari Amar Bikutra, Rav Zavid Amar Bebeisakise. Yet Rav Mari said, yes, it's true. In Grama Benizakin, Rav will say, for what types of usage? That let's say Reuben's going ahead and he's doing something that causes a lot of smoke on my property. So for that, there is no chazaka, even if he's been doing it for a long time, because that causes active, visible damage. Similarly, at Beis HaKisei, let's say Reuben's been using my property as a bathroom, right? He's been using it as a latrine for a long amount of time. So then what's happened? Like an outhouse. And remember again, the whole chap with Beis HaKisei, look at Rashi, that's actually very important. Sha'gabe karka, v'nira le'inayim, shekach hayabate kisa shavem. So we'll say, a Beis HaKisei, without getting into Talmudic, outdoor plumbing, but, again, a Beis HaKisei was not a hole in the ground. The Beis HaKisei was where there was human waste on top of the ground. The idea over here is that I can see this and I can smell it, and therefore again it poses an active damage to the landowner. So to the landowner. So therefore, the Reb Mari is saying, when do we say in chazaka l'nizakin? That was in a case of like smoke, or like the Beis Hakisei. Amar le hani l'didi da'anina datoi ki kutra Beis Hakisei damule. So Rabbi Yosef said to me, he says, I am an anina. I'm in what we call, I guess, like an istinus, a fastidious individual, right? A delicate person. So he says, for me, the blood on the dates, because we'll say the blood on the dates, if you think about it, is not an act of loss, because technically speaking, could be washed off. So he also says, but just for me seeing this, and for me experiencing this, for me this is no different than the smoke, this is no different ultimately than the bathroom. And therefore again, I am ordering the blood letters to stop. So we'll say, so it comes out over here, just the Gemara is kind of teasing us a little bit with a couple of very interesting ideas. First of all, the Gemara is bringing up the sugya of grama b'nizakin. Is there such a thing, or is there liability for causative damages? And number two, in the world of chazaka, so the Gemara is establishing ein chazaka l'nizakin. That at the end of the day, no matter how long you have used a piece of property, if your usage is injurious to the owner, so ultimately you can establish no chazaka over that property. Good. Says the Mishnah, we distance a dovecote from the city 50 amas. 50 amas. And we'll say, now why is that? Look at Rashi. Shayonim mafsidin zarone ginos. Both said, this is actually quite interesting. So remember, with the dovecote, it's a fascinating thing. These are free-range doves. Sappers are free-range doves. They are eating whatever they're eating from the field. They come home to live in this dovecote. So the idea is, what we don't want the doves feeding on people's personal property. So what do? We distance the dovecotes from the outskirts of the city 50 amas. This way, again, now what we'll see is 50 amas seems to be the amount that a dove will travel for food. So therefore, again, the dove will not feed on any of the local fields. Similarly, a person should not make a dovecote in his property unless what? Unless he has enough land to provide space 50 amos in every direction. So if I want to go ahead and put a dovecote in my property, there has to be at least 50 amos between the dovecote and my property line in every single direction, so that the doves will feed on my property and nowhere else. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Beis Arba Kurin. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not enough to have 50 amos in one direction, in each direction. Rather, you have to have a land of 4 kor. So we'll say 4 kor would ultimately mean 275 amos in each direction. So Yehuda seems to say that the dove flies much more to scavenge for food, and therefore again you need a much greater distance in each direction of your property. Malay Shegar Hayona, because that is the amount that is considered to be, I will say, the direct flight of the Yona. If the dove takes flight, it'll travel 275 amos at a clip uninterrupted. So the Gemara says, Vim lakcho afilu beisru bahari becheskas. Now, this is very interesting. However, if you go ahead and you purchased a piece of property, or I should say differently, you purchased a dovecote on a piece of property, but there is not 50 amos from the dovecote to the edge of the property line, so obviously the previous owner established a chazaka on this dovecote with these property dimensions, and therefore either purchaser and permitted to use it as well. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Ve'im lacho kimoshehu imakarka. So we'll say, so the case over here is, remember we just got finished saying that if you want to put a dovecote on your property, you need at least 50 amos in every direction of the dovecote. Comes along the Gemara and says, but let's say I bought a dovecote from Ruvain, and in Ruvain's field, there's 20 amos from the dovecote to the edge of the field in every direction. So the Mishnah says, I am permitted to purchase that dovecote. The purchase stands, and I need not change anything in the circumstances. Rashi says, "V'im lacho kimoshu." I bought the dovecote as it is, imakarka, with the land. Afilu ino kol salivav ela beis rova hakav. Even if there's only, let's say, quarter of a kav of land, harehu bechazkaso shayhochsak bo arishon kain. Since Reuven had a chazaka to use the land like this, therefore when I purchase the land, I essentially purchase his chazaka as well. So, says the Gemara, Chamishim Amma V'sulo. Now the Mishnah makes it sound like a dove only flies 50 amas. Is that true? A dove only flies 50 amas, or mini hareza kasha Ein parsin nishbin liyonim. You cannot go ahead and set out a trap for a dove. Ella imkin hayarachok min hayishuv shloshim ris. Yet I will say we learned that what? You cannot set a trap for a dove unless, of course, you are distancing your trap from Yishuv, from habitation, from the city, right? 30 ris. I will say, just so you understand, 30 ris is approximately 8,000 amos. So I'll say that's a pretty significant distance. But it's telling me is what? Because what am I concerned about? If I'm going ahead and setting dove traps, so we'll say, what do I have to be concerned about? Trapping someone else's dove. So therefore the Gemara seems to tell me over here that's what? I need to distance my traps from the nearest city or from the nearest habitation. 30 ris, 8,000 amos, so that any dove that comes into my trap is a free dove. It doesn't belong to anyone. So that's obviously much more than the 50 amos of the Mishnah. Amar Abaye, Meishat Shayetuva, Ukreisayu bechamishim amsam malya. This is interesting. We'll say. Abaye says it's true. Doves fly a very long distance, but they fill their stomachs. In other words, they eat only what they find within the first 50 hours. Remember again, the Mishnah Bosai is not concerned with the duration or the length of dove flight. The Mishnah is concerned with dove consumption. And therefore explains the Gemara that Lamaisa, they could fly a much greater distance, but at the end of the day will only eat what they find within the first 50 amas. Visulo, the Gemara says, is that true? Nothing else? But we learned, Obiyishov, afilu mea mil lo yifros. Yet we learned also that in inhabited areas, one should not go ahead and spread out the traps even for 100 mil, which makes it sound like, again, that even out the flight, the dove could go ahead and travel much further. Rav Yosef Amar b'Yishuv Kramim. Rav Yosef says, that brisa that spoke about the idea that you have to distance the traps 100 mil was talking about a situation where there are contiguous vineyards. Look at Rashi. The Yishuv Kramim, Sheparachin Mikarim Lekarim, Vishatim Harbe. But say if we're talking about an area where there is a contiguous vineyards, so then ultimately, again, the birds travel a much longer distance. Why? Because they're jumping vine to vine to vine. So that's so they could travel a much longer distance. Rava Amar B'Yishuv Shovchin. Ravi says, what are we talking about? Where there are a lot of dovecotes. So therefore the dove travels from coat to coat. So we'll say, essentially what the Gemara is answering is like this. The dove, when it just has to take straight flight, and there are no dove rest stops. There's nowhere to stop. There's nowhere for it to land and continue. So then it'll travel a certain amount, right? Whether that amount is 50 amas, whether that amount is shloshim ris, whether it's ultimately again 10, whatever it is. But when there is habitation in the middle, whether that is vineyards or whether it's other dovecotes, so of course then the dove could travel a much further distance. You'll say to yourself, who cares about the duration or the trajectory of dove flight? So it matters because if you are a dove hunter and ultimately again you are setting traps, so you have to know at what distance you need to set your traps in order to avoid catching a dove that is owned by someone else. But one second, Rava, if you're talking about again, we're talking about a place where there's a lot of dovecotes, then you should have to remember you have to distance the traps from the furthest dovecote. So it could either be where those other dovecotes belong to me, and therefore again I have obviously no obligation of a trap set back from my own dovecotes, or they could belong to a Gentile, in which case, again, what the Gemara seems to be saying over here is should the dove of a Gentile wander into my trap, it would be permitted. Or the other possibility is that we're talking about that they are hefker. They're ownerless dovecotes. In other words, no one owns them, or at least now no one owns them, and therefore again when the bird is hopping from dovecote to dovecote, there's a certain distance I have to distance the traps from the city, but not from these abandoned dovecotes. Fine, says the Gemara, Rabbi Huda Omer base arba kurin. So remember, Rabbi Huda disagreed with the Tanakama, whereas the Tanakama said that if I put up a dovecote in my property, I need 50 amas in every direction. Rabbi Huda says, no, I need 275 amas in every direction. But, so here's the operative piece we're going to be focusing on. If I bought a piece of property that has a dovecote on it, and there's less than 50 amas in every direction, then the same way the previous owner had a chazaka to use this dovecote, I purchased that chazaka as well. Amar, bless you. Amar Papa Vitim Rav Zvid. Zosamers, this teaches us, and this is actually very interesting. Toanin lelokeach, v'toanin liyoresh. This teaches us that Beis Din advocates for a purchaser and Beis Din advocates for someone who inherits property as well. What this is, look at Rashi just a moment. Toran liyoresh toran lokeach. Beis Din poschen peh v'taina liyoresh lokeach she'ir adam alehem v'yesh lo edim shahaisa shalo o shalavosav v'zeh omer yirashtev me'aba o lakachtev miploni shehochsak bo yomim rabim. So let's say again, I inherit property, or for our purposes, I purchase a piece of property, and it's known, there's eidos, that the previous owner lived on that property for a significant amount of time, long enough to establish chazaka, whatever that amount of time is. And let's say again, I'm able to produce witnesses that the previous owner lived on that land for 3 years. Tonen lo Beis Din uposchen lo peh ve'ilu lemish lo yarshav lo locha ma'achar kisha amar lo ha'ma'arer ma ta'osa v'soshali v'amar chzakti ba gimel shar v'lo amar li davar. So I will say, so listen to this. Essentially what the Gemara is saying is the following. If I purchase a piece of property, then Beis Din advocates on my behalf. As long as I could go ahead and prove that the previous owner ultimately went ahead and lived there with 3 years of chazaka, then ultimately Beis Din will advocate on my behalf that what? That I should be permitted to have the continued same use of the property, even if the use of that property differs a bit from the normal conventional halachic norms. Like for example, in this case over here, I'm buying a dovecote in a piece of property that there are not 50 amas between the dovecote and the border of the land. But as long as I could go ahead and bring eidos that Reuven lived here, and Reuven lived here for 3 years, Beis Din will say, okay, if Reuven had the chazaka, I have the chazaka as well. So the Gemara says, Yoresh Tanina. So we learned this already by Yoresh. Haba Mishum Yerusha, Eno Tzarech Taina. That the boss says, somebody inherits land. If somebody inherits land, good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. If somebody inherits land, I don't have to go ahead and prove my father's ownership of land. Let's say I inherit land, and so somebody comes along and says that was my land. So we'll say I don't have an obligation to prove who my father bought the lands from. That's not my obligation. As long as what? As long as there is eidos that my father lived on this land for more than 3 years, then ultimately, again, that is enough. So the Gemara says, however, lokeach et shrichale. Rabbi say we need to teach the case of a person who purchases property. So the Gemara says, lokeach nami tarina. We also in the case of the purchaser. What's the case of the purchaser? Laka chatzer ubazis in the gusturos. So let's listen to this. If a person, I purchased the chatzer. Now this is actually really fascinating. I purchased the chatzer, and I will say the chatzer has zizin v'gustros. Gizin v'gustros means like there are beams or different things protruding from my property into the Rishus Harabim, into the public domain. So what happens? So look at Rashi. Laka chatzer ubag zizin b'masnisin b'ches chasabat and tnan ein motzi and zizin v'gustros Rishus Harabim adam abon abayis lo yotzi rashi akoros tikras lo Rishus Harabim avalim rotze konis binyono l'soch shalo ubona umotzi roshe korosov l'chutz v'mlaka chatzer ubag zizin v'gustros yotzi Rishus Harabim harehu b'ches kasa shebit. So let's listen to this. So if I'm building property, I can't have beam protrusions into Shurab. So it's like, what do you call it?
Cantilevered barrier.
A what?
Yeah.
Like the thing you build on your deck.
Pergola.
A pergola. All right, the thing you build on your deck with the protrusions. Right? So imagine, like you have it for your. So imagine for a moment. I'm sorry. Arbor. Arbor.
Pergola.
Yeah, the top arbor. Good. So thank you. So the point over here is there's wood sticking into the Rosh Hashanah, right? That's right, trellis, right? Good, whatever it is. That's the, okay, enough. Good. So what happens is protruding to something. I both say, you are not permitted to have, which if you think about it, is obviously very logical. You can't have anything from your personal property protruding into the Rosh Hashanah. So let's say, I will say, but I purchase a piece of property from Reuven, and he has his deck thing protruding into the Rosh Hashanah. So we'll say, so the halacha is, I have a chazaka, meaning I have purchased his chazaka as well. To which the Gemara said, Tzricha. So we'll say, so now essentially we've learned the same principle in both cases. What's the same principle? That whether you inherit land or you purchase land, you inherit the usage of the previous owner, and we assume as long as you can prove that the previous owner has established requisite chazakah by usage or by domicile for the last 3 years, then that's all. You don't have to prove anything else. To which the Gemara says, I need both of these cases. You know why? So we'll say, because in the case of a Shesarabim, I could have said that at the end of the day, he's not really building a Shesarabim. Maybe what happened? Maybe he recessed his property, and although it looks like it's protruding into the Shesarabim, in fact the property line is really right under the protrusions. Or perhaps, again, he got a dispensation from the Rosh Hashanah. Now, we'll discuss in later sugyas how you do that. But in the case of Yerusha, maybe I have to prove ultimately again how my father attained ownership. And if it would have just said the case, over here, then what? So we'll say, if it would have just said the case of Yerusha, I might have said that, you know what, maybe that's because my father was able to mafayes, he was able to appease whoever it was, or the other individual, the close neighbors, were mochel, the proximity of the shovach, aval rabim man payis uman shavik. But by the rabbim, Rabbi will say, who has the right to go ahead and be appeased? Who has the right to go ahead and forgive the right of the rabbim? Therefore, tzricha. So we'll say, so bottom line is, halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you purchase a piece of property, or you inherit a piece of property, and the property does not conform to the normal conventional standards, like for our purposes, we've established, let's assume right now, that you need at least a 50 amas setback from the nearest property for your shovach. I inherit or I purchase a piece of property where there's only 25 amas between the shovach and the property line. As long as I could establish that the previous owner, whether that's my father or whether ultimately again that's Ruvain, the previous owner, had 3 years of chazakah, that is enough. I don't have to know how he established chazakah. I don't have to know how he worked this out with the neighbors, but as long as I know, I can prove, I have eidos, that he established chazakah, I inherit that pre-existing chazakah as well. Says the Gemara, Harihu b'chazkaso. I have 1 second, but how can you say that? We said before that what? There is no chazakah for something Rabbi said that is deleterious or that is damaging to my neighbor. Having a shovach only 25 amas away from my neighbor is nezek. So then how could I establish a chazakah for nezek? To which the Gemara says, Rav Mari Amar Bekutra, Rav Zvid Amar Beisakise. No, what type of nezek? Both say that is clear, obvious, and apparent nezek. Something like smoke, something like the Beis HaKisei, where ultimately the offense is blatant. So that's when you can't have chazakah for nizakin. But for something that's not as blatant, like the dovecoat, one could establish chazakah. Good. Amud Bezer will say the Mishnah. Nipo hanimtza b'socha mishmaler. We'll say this is an incredible case. So what happens? I find a little dove. Dovelo. Right? I find a little dove over here. Hanimtza b'socha mishmaler. So we'll say what happens? I find a little dove next to the shovach. Now, obviously, anything you find in the shovach, we know belongs to that shovach. I find the dove within 50 amas of the shovach. What's the halacha? Harehu shabal hashovach. Ultimately, again, that dove is the property of the nearest shovach. In other words, we assume that any dove found within 50 amas of the dovecoat is a member of that dovecoat. Chutz mechamishim amo harehu shabal. So, we'll say if I find the dove, however, what? Out 50 amas away from the nearest dovecoat, then what? I find it more than 50 amas away from the nearest dovecoat, then what? I'm permitted to keep it. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, Harehu shamozo, nimtza bein shtei shavchos. So we'll say, what happens if the dove is found in between two dovecoats? He's like gittin, karov lezeh shalo. So we'll say, karov lezeh shalo. So we'll say, the idea is what? The idea is that whichever, again, so if I have two dovecoats, so let's say again, let's say for argument's sake, those dovecoats, again, either their 50 amas are absorbed within each other, whichever dovecoat the dove is closest to, that's the dovecoat the dove belongs to. Mechza. What happens if it's mamish found right in the middle of the area between the two dovecoats? Then yachloku. Then Rabbi said the owner of the two dovecoats split the value of that dove. Fine. So Rabbi says, now this leads the Gemara to a very interesting observation. The Gemara says, based on this, what do we see? Amar Rav Chanina, Rov v'karov Holchin Acharov. Both is actually very interesting. So remember, there are different ways in which in halacha we go ahead and we resolve certain what we'll call situational ambiguity. And the way we do that is either through rov, the majority, or karov, proximity. Majority, proximity. So let's say again, when using rov and karov, let's say that yields two different results. So which one ultimately wins out? So Rabbi Chanina says, when you have a conflict between the majority and proximity, holchin achar harov. We go ahead and we follow the majority. Va'afal gav diruba doraisa, the kurba doraisa. I will say, even though both of these concepts are ultimately midaraisa. Well, now take a look at Rashi over here. This is actually really interesting. Rov v'karov. Rashi says, "In bal davar lefanenu, v'yesh bo lahalik achar harov v'hukach, im telech po achar hakarov inokach." So we'll say, so again, let's say I have a matter of ambiguity that comes before me, and if I follow the rov, I'll have one result, and if I follow karov, proximity, I'll have a different result. What's the halacha? Halach po achar harov. We follow the rov. So rov, right? We let the majority. Well, and we'll see how this plays out. But this is actually very interesting. So we'll say we know rov because the Torah says explicitly acharei rabim lahatos. We'll see it not in this week's parsha, but in next week's parsha. Mishpatim, Torah tells us that you have to follow the majority. We'll say, where do we know the concept of karov? This is amazing. We'll say, you know where we learn the concept of karov, of proximity? From Egla Arufa. Egla Arufa, remember again, is the situation where you find a corpse in between two cities. You don't know what happened. The person was murdered, but you don't know what happened. So what happens? The elders of the closest city have to go through this process of bringing out the calf, decapitating the calf, washing their hands over the carcass. We'll say, so we're assuming liability based on what? Based on proximity. Karov. So you see that both rov and karov are both doraisa concepts. But says Rabbi Chanina that when there's a conflict between rov and karov, we follow rov, even though they're both doraisa concepts. Afilu hachi ruba adif. Nevertheless, I will say rov will be adif. We'll go ahead and we will allow the laws of majority to determine the outcome of the circumstance. So is that true? Massive Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says, but 1 second. So also remember again, by Egla Rufa, like we just said, which is the source for the concept of karov. So the Torah says that the closest city, the elders will come out. Now we can infer from that that's what? Va'afa gav di'ika achrisa dinafi shamine. Now that sounds like what? We look for the closest city, even though what? There may be another city that although it's not as close to the corpse, has what? Has more people. Yet, we'll still go with proximity over majority. So Rabbi Chanina, you're saying that whenever there's a conflict between rov and karov, we go after rov. But from the case of Egla Rufa, would appear that even if there's another city with more people, but you go after the closest city, even if there's fewer people. So you see that when you have a conflict between rov and karov, you go after what? You go after karov. To which the Gemara says, no, bidaleka. The case, we'll say the paradigmatic case of Egla Rufa is where there is no other city with more people in closer proximity. I should say differently. There is no closer city. There is no city with a greater number of people. So, 1 second. There's always another city with a greater number of people. But laser basa ruba da'alma. Others will say, on a very simple level, the majority of let's say they find the corpse next to city A. So city A has the quote unquote karov, right? It has proximity. I will say, but it doesn't have rov, right? The rov of the world does not live in city A. So why wouldn't we assume that the murderer came from the rov of the world? To which the Gemara says, Biyosheves bein harim. Because most of the paradigmatic case over here is where the city, which has proximity, is it's nestled in between mountains. I was going to say nestled in between mountains. Look at Rashi, bein harim, shein derech rotzchem, lavo mimikomos achirim lakan. I will say that essentially we're talking about a place over here that is cut off a little bit from pedestrian traffic. That unless you live here, people would not normally be here. So the Gemara says, Tanan, yet we learned, Nipa hanimtza b'socha mishim ama, harehu shal bala shovach. I will say, yet we learned that what? That if you find a dove within 50 amas of the dovecote, it belongs to that particular dovecote. So we'll say that's a din in karov, right? That's a din ultimately in proximity. Even though there might be another dovecote, Rabbi said, that although it may be further away, may have a larger dove population. So what do you see from here? You see that when you have a conflict between Karov and Rov, you go with what? You go with Karov. We're looking at proximity. That contradicts Rabbi Hanina, who says that when there's a conflict between Rov and Karov, you go after Rov. To which the Gemara answers, B'deleka. No. The case of the Mishnah Abosai is there is no other dovecote. Iachi, if that's the case, Ema Seifa, Chutz Mi Chamishim Ama Harehu Shal Motzo. Then what do you do at the end of the Mishnah? Because the end of the Mishnah said, let's say you found the dove outside the 50 amas, so then ultimately what? Then the person who finds it is permitted to keep it. V'i B'deleka, if we're talking about a case where there is no other dovecote, then what? Then Vadai Me'ahu Nafal. Let's say, if you're telling me there's no other dovecote, then even if what? Even if I find that dove outside of 50 amas, we'll say I should assume that what? That dove belongs to that dovecote, because there is no other dovecote in the area. So where else did the dove come from? To which the Gemara says, Hachamayaskinon, what's the case? B'madada. Where ultimately, again, the dove is hopping. We'll say, now look at Rashi for just a moment. Hachamayaskinon. We could explain our entire Mishnah b'madada. Ultimately, again with hopping. What does this mean? Begozal she'ino yachol ela b'didui ma'at ma'at. Well, so we're dealing with a dove that cannot yet fly. If it cannot yet fly, so how does it get from place to place? It hops around. So we'll say. So what does Rashi say? Hilchach tocha mishim ama shabala shovach. Because we'll say this why in this case over here, when it's found within 50 amas of the dovecote, even though there might be another dovecote that has more doves, we assume that this dove is the property of the karov, the closer dovecote. Why? Because we'll say it is known that when doves can't fly and they only hop up to 50 amas away. The chutzah chamisha shamotzo, the chayvan dein madada yoser mechamishim, v'zeh yatsa chutz lenun nafak le mitoras madada, v'kam le b'toras mafriach, v'ikalamezel bei Basra ruba da'ama. So we'll say what the Gemara is suggesting is the following: we're dealing now over here with a dove that ultimately again could only hop. If it's found within 50 amas, then what? Then the Maisa again we assume that it came from the karav, it came from the nearest dovecote, or I should say the dovecote in 50 amas, because the Maisa Madada can't go any more than that. If on the other hand you find it outside of the 50 amas, it cannot have come from that first dovecote, and therefore ultimately it is the property of the one who finds it. The Gemara says, the Amar Rav Ukva Bar Chama Kala Medade Eno Medade Yoser Minun. Any dove that does not yet fly and is hopping cannot hop more than 50 amas. Fine. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, we'll say this is an interesting exchange. So Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the following kasha. So we'll say, so first of all, you should know in general, we paskin like that statement of Rabbi Hanina, that when there is a conflict between Rov and Karov, we go after Rov. So when there is a conflict between majority and proximity, we generally will allow majority to govern the particular halacha. Again, it's not true in every single circumstance, but as a klal, as a general principle, that's what we accept. So, Rabbi Yirmiyah, let's listen to this. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the following kasha: Raglo achas besochnu nama, veraglo achas chutz mechamishim ama. We'll say, what happens if you find the dove? 1 foot is in the 50 amas by the shovach, 1 foot is outside of the 50 amas of the shovach. What's the halacha? To which the Gemara says, Va'aldo Afku Rabbi Yirmiyah mibei midrasha, and for this they threw Rabbi Yirmiyah out of the base medrash. As I say, they said to him, like, really, like that's what you're going to bother us with. And I will say, now the truth is, this is actually a very strange idea, because the truth is, you'll say to yourself, come on, that's a ridiculous question. The Gemara always deals with questions like this. So Tosas actually discusses. If you look at Rashi, Tosas. So Tosas says, "Va'al daf kol Rabbi Yirmiyah mei midrasha in the farish mishum de boi milsa de lo shchicha klal deichi yisrami de ragla achas to chamishim ragla achas chutz lechamishim b'tzimtzum to ashkecham masis nami v'chai gavna." I read diktani mechza yacholku. Now both say, maybe let's Rabbi Yirmiyah. That's so ridiculous. Why? Because you can never have a dove that exactly has 1 foot inside the 50, 1 foot outside the 50. It's not true, because the Mishnah said it. The Mishnah spoke about a case of mechza, where let's say again you find the dove exactly in between two dovecotes. So it's Yabbo said that we do entertain this possibility of straddling this area. So what's so crazy about 1 foot in, 1 foot out? To which the Gemara says, Venira l'Rabbeinu tam, demishum hachiafku, mishum demadada eino medad deklal yosem mechamishimama, afilu ragla achos, dechomidos chachamim kenu. To which Tosfos explains, because now, since we've established this case, ultimately as one of hopping, so we've established that Chazal's shiurim are absolute. Chazal said that ultimately, again, what? Ultimately, a hopping dove only hops 50 amas, and 50 amas means 50 amas. 50 amas doesn't mean 50 amas and a dove's foot. It means 50 amas. So once you know what they're telling Rabbi Yomi is, once we've established the shear, stop it. So I'll say, so it's interesting, by the way, I just have to tell you. So I'll just tell you two quick things on this. Thank you, Moshe. Two quick things on this. So first of all, the Arizal writes the following. Listen to this. The Arizal says, "V'hin Rabbi Yirmiyah hayashol shelos tamid shelos." I'm sorry, hayashol tamid shelos. Kimo shmuva harbe pamim b'shas by Rabbi Yirmiyah ulefi shahaysa kavanasa l'tova ulahag dil Torah ladir b'shelosav ubay shuha v'afkul midrashav. So the Arizal says that the other people in the Beis Medrash mistreated Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah was always that guy with questions. Always that guy with questions. I will say, now, sometimes people ask questions, just ask questions. They just like to hear themselves speak. That wasn't Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah's point was to ask questions to get the conversation going. Sometimes the questions themselves are there just to fuel thinking. And the Arizal says, they embarrassed Rabbi Yirmiyah. They embarrassed him by throwing him out of the Beis Medrash. Listen to this. Lachein yesh lo schar tov l'mala. Therefore, Rabbi Yirmiyah had incredible schar in the Olam HaEmes. Ki kol ha'she'elos hanish'alos b'mesifta d'rakia hu hashoal osam v'nishalos al yado. I will say, now I could just read this to you. This is from the Arizal and Shar HaGilgulim. So I don't know what this means. All I can tell you is the following. The Arizal writes that in the Mesifta d'rakia, in the Yeshiva Shal Mala, Rabbi Yirmiyah is the one who asks all of the questions in the Beis Medrash. So the Arizal says in the schus of his desire to stimulate Talmud Torah discussion here in this world, and because he was embarrassed for doing so, his schar is that he gets to pose the questions in the Mesifta d'rakia, which is absolutely quite amazing. So I'll say that's on. I don't know what it means. I was just riveted when I saw it. So there's another idea that I want to share with you also. Another idea that the Pnei Menachem, the Ger Rebbe, also brings down, and he says the following. He quotes from his father. Listen to this. Quotes from Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah's kasha was achas mi bifnim, right? V'ragla achas mi bachutz. 1 foot on the inside, 1 foot on the outside. What's the halacha? And they threw Rabbi Yirmiyah out of the Beis Medrash. So the Pnei Menachem says amazing. He says, listen to this. Rabbi says, get ready for this. She'ish Yisrael tzarich lihios b'shtei raglov bifnim. I will say, in life, if a person wants to remain rooted in Torah, you can't have 1 foot here and 1 foot there. Rather, again, both feet must be rooted ultimately within Torah. V'kasheru omeid beregal achos b'chutz ein zetov. When ultimately, again, one of those feet is planted b'chutz, outside of Torah, that is not going to be good. Sarach sheyiyu kulu bifnim. And the Pnei Menachem says something amazing. He says, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, what happens if it's raglo achas b'chutz, raglo achas bifnim, al do afkuhu mi be'midrasha. We'll say, it's an amazing yesod. We all have to live in multiple worlds. But you could live in multiple worlds while still having both of your feet planted inside the Beis Medrash. Having both of your feet planted inside the world of Torah. Having both of your feet planted within your Yiddishkeit. We can't always live within the walls of the Beis Medrash. Most of us can't live much time inside the walls of the Beis Medrash. But the shaila is, where are our feet planted? Where are our roots? Where ultimately do we establish our foundation? Because if you try to establish some of your foundation in the world of Torah and some of your foundation outside of the world of Torah, clinical tests have shown that what will end up happening is the part of your foundation that is in the world of Torah will be dragged out into that other world. But if you go ahead and you establish your foundation within Torah, then even if sometimes you have to venture out, which inevitably we all have to, nevertheless, because your foundation is in Torah, because both feet are in Torah, you will always remain rooted in that world. So again, you have the Arizal understanding that this is mamish, like Rabbi Yomi is being mistreated over here in the Beis Medrash, but his great schar is that he is the one who poses the shilas in the Masifta Derakia. You have the Ger Rebbe who explains that this is an incredible metaphor. Don't live life with one foot in, one foot out. You got to be all in. If you want to be a Torah Jew, you have to be all in, both feet in the Beis Medrash. Establish your foundation in the world of Torah, and then even if you have to venture out, inevitably, as we all have to, ultimately your foundation is solidified. Let's just do one more line. Tashma nimtza bein shtei shochos v'karov lezeh shelo va'af agav dechad minayhu nafesh mechavrei. So let's remember again, what did we learn? We learned that if you find the bird in between two dovecotes, right? Karov lezeh shelo. If it's closer to dovecot A, it belongs to dovecot A. Karov lezeh shelo, closer to dovecot B, it belongs to dovecot B. Va'af agav dechad minayhu nafesh mechavrei. Now, we'll say, even though what? Even though one dovecote has more doves than its fellow. So what do you see from here? You see from here that when there is a conflict between Rov and Karov, then what wins? Karov wins. Karov wins. And that's a shayla ultimately again in Rabbi Chanina. To which the Gemara says, no, hacham askinon, shishnein shavin. We'll say both of them have the same amount of doves. Therefore, there's no conflict between Rov and Karov. There is no Rov, and therefore we go after Karov. But why don't we go after the majority of the world? We'll say there's always a rove, and the rove is not this dovecote. Hacham askinu, what's the case about say? B'shvil shal kramim. About say the case over here is we're talking about where the pathway ultimately again is not paved, but the pathway is ultimately filled with vineyards. Rashi says, "B'shil shal kramim, da'idei kramim nadida chutz lechamishim, umir Basra da'alma leka lemezal ducholam da'de v'chazi lekino kishemachzi rosham madida ilo madida." So let me read in the Gemara. B'shil shal kramim. So what happens? The way it's making its way out is because of the vineyards. Dim isa dim alma asi. We'll say if it would have come from somewhere else, kevan demididi lo matzi asi. It would not have come. Could not have come from somewhere else. Why? Dechol mididi v'hader chazile v'kinei mididi v'ilo lo mididi. I will say, interestingly enough, the way it works with doves is that when a dove is hopping, it will only hop as far as long as it could see what? As long as it could see its shovach, its dovecote. But a dove, if it's hopping, will not hop far enough that it's out of eyesight, or eyeshot, is that the right word? Eyesight of its dovecote. Therefore, I will say, in this particular case, we are able to say that because it is within eyesight of its dovecote, that establishes for us that it must belong to that particular dovecote. So we'll stop over here again. So remember, we are still discussing the concept or the conflict between Rov and Karov. So we have Rabbi Chanina telling us that when there is a conflict between Rov and Karov, majority and proximity, we will go after majority. Our Mishnah, the Gemara suggests, seems to not necessarily totally agree with that concept. Session to be continued tomorrow.